Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We have a full house today. We have 81 people registered to be in person and 50 online. So if you can do your best to help people find the empty seats, that would be most helpful. I'm Randall Miller. I'm chair of the Social Sciences Committee of HASP, and we are delighted today to have you here for this course on why people are leaving religion. And you can see Dr. Van Tongeren's role on the screen, but let me give you a little bit more information about his background. He received his PhD in experimental social psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University, his MA from the University of Colorado, and a BA from Colorado Christian University. His research focuses on the social motivation for meaning and its relation to virtues and morality. He and his students study meaning in life, religion, and virtues such as forgiveness and humility. And perhaps some of you were with us whenever he taught the course in humility, and that's a major reason that he's here today. So please welcome Dr. Van Tongeren.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited about being here. When I gave the presentation, I think it was last semester on humility, I honestly say that presenting to you is like a highlight. It is perhaps one of my favorite presentations I've ever given. So I was actually very excited and am very excited to come back. And I'm really excited that so many people are interested in why people are leaving religion. And so what I'm going to do is I want us to have a really interactive conversation. And the thing that I know, because I presented with you before, is you're very interactive. And so you are welcome to raise your hand at any point. If you have any questions, you want to pause, you want to interject, you think I'm just plain wrong, please tell me, and we can have a good discussion. So today, the presentation is called Exodus, Why are people leaving religion? And whenever I tell people that I study people leaving religion, the first thing that they usually say is, oh, I know the answer to that. And so, oh, great. Why is that? And they're like, oh, well, it's COVID. COVID's the reason why people are leaving religion. And I say, well, what do you mean? They're like, oh, well, everyone, they went online because of COVID and then no one wants to go back. And to me, that's such a superficial answer. I mean, I've even read articles in really prestigious publications, right? Even like the New York Times or the Atlantic is like, oh, the reason people are leaving religion is because church went virtual. But I don't know about you. During COVID, they said stop going to restaurants, and I did. But now that I can go back, it's not like I stopped going back to restaurants, right? Because I paused for a little while, right? So there has to be something else, right? There has to be some other motivation as to why people are not returning, or why people have left religion, than just the inconvenience of, oh, I have to go back to it, I have to get in my car and drive. And in fact, the reason why I think it's much more than that is I was grateful to have received, let's see, it's not advancing. There we go. I was grateful to have received an external research grant from the John Templeton Foundation in 2018. So I've been studying this for well over 5 years, and we've been documenting kind of the reasons why people are leaving religion for well before COVID was even on the scene. And so today I'm going to try to just provide you a really brief overview of about a 5 to 6 year research program on why people are leaving religion and what happens to people after they leave religion. So I figured, in honor of religion, I think 7 is kind of a holy number. We're going to talk about 7 big ideas today. So the first big idea is we're going to talk about the 4 horsemen. And it's not the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It's going to be the 4 horsemen of religion's apocalypse. So basically, what are 4 big reasons why people are leaving religion? Yes.
Wait for the microphone. Wait for the microphone. Not really loudly. Wait for the microphone.
Yeah.
Are you talking about leaving organized religion or leaving any faith?
Yes, that's a great question. So I'm going to talk about reasons why people stop identifying as religious. So they say, I am no longer religious. And I realize that means different things to different people. So that's why the second one, I love that you said that, is we're going to actually look at different ways people in their own minds, and when reporting to researchers, have said, I've left religion, because there's different ways to go about doing that. That's why I got into what a field of study called de-identification. So saying I no longer identify as religious, which is different than something as vague as like deconversion, because I'm not really sure what it means to deconvert. We'll get to those. Yeah, this is just the overview. We're going to talk about the diversity of religious duns. We're going to talk about a concept called religious residue. We're going to talk about a phenomenon called a sheep and wolf's clothing. Some of you are like, oh no, he has a typo. That should be a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's not. I assure you, it's not a typo. We're going to talk about a set of studies I did with my students that they entitled To Hell with the Devil. And then finally, we're going to talk about how can we embrace people who have left religion? Because maybe I'm describing you, or maybe I'm describing someone you know, but my sense is there's someone in your social circle, someone that you know who has left religion. Sound okay? All right, let's get to the first big idea. Big idea number one, these are the four horsemen. These are the four big reasons I think people are leaving religion. I think some of these might be controversial. My sense is that you'll have a lot to say about this. So again, feel free to raise your hand. So if we just zoom out, sociologists have been telling us, and according to Pew Research, for the past 30 years, people have been leaving religion. This well predates COVID. This predates lots of current events. In fact, over the past 30 years, the number of Christians in the US has dropped from 90% to about 63%. And they've modeled these data. And what they suggest is that by 2070, Christianity will no longer be the majority religion in the United States. Okay, that's not that far off if you think about it. That's not that far away. Now, a lot of research has focused on what are called the religious nuns. Okay, and these are not the ones who wear the black, right, and kind of go right. These are the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. When they're asked what religion, what is your religion, they'll say none. I have no religious affiliation. 78% of these were raised religious before walking away from their faith. Okay, so it's not that we're just seeing a secularization of people who aren't religious, raise children who are not religious. That's part of it. But a big part of it is people who are raised religious are leaving. And in fact, 1 in 3 individuals raised Christian will leave the faith by the time they reach age 30. So these are some pretty staggering numbers if you think about the landscape in the US. Yes, question in the back. We have a
Do these types of trends hold true for other religious faiths?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we do kind of see across the board religious affiliation is on the decrease. Christianity is experiencing the sharpest decrease because it's the largest proportion in the US. So we are seeing the steepest drops in the US, but across the board, religious affiliation is decreasing. I do think there are some reasons why Christianity in particular is decreasing more than other faiths, which we'll hint at. Another question.
What about the works of Andy Stanley?
Tell me about Andy Stanley.
Well, what Andy Stanley has written is that a lot of people have left because of the fact that they have a misunderstanding, and this is really kind of his understanding of what he says of what the Old Testament is in relation to the New Testament, and how many people have kind of mixed and matched what was, in his terms, what was a history of a people versus a religion for the world. And how, in his case, he believes that, and his statements really deal more with the fact that people have left because they feel that a lot of religion is still predicated upon a mix and match of what was old and what is new. Whereas in his case, he believes that we have a new covenant, which really replaces the old covenant. I mean, in a nutshell, that's kind of.
Yeah. So I guess the question is it possible that some people are leaving because of a theological difference, right? Like a theological misunderstanding. I think that could be part of it. I think that is a bit part of it, but I think that's a pretty thin slice. Like, I think if we ask people, why are you leaving? I think very few would say, well, I'm more of a New Testament person than an Old Testament person, right? Like the reasons are actually a lot simpler, sadly, than kind of like theological, a lack of theological sophistication. I do think that there's one area which we'll get to that I think theology needs to be a little bit richer in, and we'll get to that in just a second. So in addition to the religious nuns, my colleagues and I have studied what we call the religious duns. So these are people who are just done with religion. Okay, so they used to identify as religious, but they no longer do. And so research from my team, as well as other researchers, suggest that there's 4 horsemen of religion's apocalypse. Okay, so the first reason why I think people are leaving religion is what I would call cultural stagnation. So many people are leaving religion because they perceive that many of religion's beliefs and teachings are antiquated, outdated, or downright oppressive. So what's ending up happening is individuals are becoming more progressive, and they're viewing their churches as stagnating or being overly conservative or reacting against more progressive kind of ideology. So usually these are issues around LGBTQ plus community, religion's teaching or views on women and racial ethnic minorities, the predominance of the patriarchy, or its restrictive views on gender and sexuality, right? So these would be people who you say, why are you leaving religion? They say, well, you know, my pastor found out that I was gay and told me I was going to hell. And well, I don't want to spend my Sunday morning there, right? I'd rather be doing something else. Or, you know, my pastor told me that as a woman, even though I feel called to preach, I can't. And so, well, I'm just going to go do something else. Okay, so the view is religion largely has stagnated. It's lost its use in culture. So why do I even need to be religious anymore? And I would say this is a pretty big portion of why people are leaving. Like probably at least half, if not more than half of people are leaving because of this reason. Another reason kind of couched in this would be kind of intellectual reasons, right? So I have a number of Hope College students that will come and they'll take my class, and I teach intro to psych and social psychology and psychological science and religion. So I'm not even like a hardcore biology course, and I'll just mention the word evolution. And then afterwards they come up to me and they're like, I feel really uncomfortable right now. First of all, I'm uncomfortable that you're not a Christian. I'm like, oh, okay. And then the second thing they get very uncomfortable about is they're like, well, I'm just very concerned. I learned that the Bible taught me that, you know, creation, 6 days, that's how we got to everything. The earth is only a few thousand years old, you know, this evolution thing. And so the kind of the misunderstanding or the mismatch of what they're being taught in college versus what they might have learned in Sunday school or at church, eventually they're going to get to the point and they're like, oh, I don't really know how to put all these things together. I think I might leave this other thing behind. I've kind of outgrown my religious beliefs. So that's the first horseman that's heading down and kind of calling for religion's apocalypse. The second reason, and this is also extremely significant, is religious trauma. And so a lot of people, a fair number, more than you actually might imagine. In our study, we saw that it was 1 in 5 participants reported this. There's other studies that suggest it might be as many as 1 in 2 people have experienced some degree of religious trauma. So religious trauma is when people experience religious or spiritual hurt. So people who are coming to the church in a vulnerable time of need, and they experience abuse or trauma based, you know, directly from the leaders, or they've witnessed this abuse either globally or locally. So when we asked some participants, why'd you leave religion? Some said, after the Catholic Church priest abuse scandal, I no longer want to be associated with the Catholic Church. Others have been punished for doubting, questioning, or not fitting into moral standards. So there have been heartbreaking stories of people who have reported, oh, I got pregnant and my pastor made me come up front in front of the entire congregation and confess all of my sins, you know, and beg for forgiveness, you know, and it's like, of course, their partner wasn't also brought up there. And of course, you know, later when the pastor was found out to have indiscretions, they got a severance package. But when people are punished for, or when people say, oh, I'm having some doubts or I'm questioning, and what they're told is, well, you need to pray that sin out of your life, that creates a series of kind of pain and of abuse that people eventually say, I don't want to be part of that anymore. And religious trauma, I mean, this is a very serious thing that lingers. It's very hard to overcome religious trauma and religious and spiritual abuse. And And a lot of times it coexists with other types of trauma and abuse. So if there are religious leaders who are being abusive in other ways, that can just kind of compound it. So the second reason why people are leaving is because of religious trauma. A third reason, and this is a little bit what I was mentioning about, this is the one place I think theology could be a little bit richer. The third horseman is what I call simplistic views of suffering. I think another reason, another thing we could call this that you might have heard of before is called toxic positivity or the prosperity gospel. Okay, and the prosperity gospel goes something like this. I'm a good person and God loves me and wants good things to happen to me. And God gives blessings to good people. And right, well, that feels pretty good. Who wants that? I kind of want that, right? So basically, if I'm faithful enough, I'm going to get, I'm going to have money. I'm going to have success in my career. I'm going to have health and prosperity. That's awesome. Sign me up. Now, that's all well and good when life is trucking along and life is going fine. Now, what happens when you experience, inevitably, as we all do, suffering? Well, that starts breaking down because what you say is, well, if good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, what does that mean about me when something bad happens to me? I must be a bad person. And you're like, oh no, what have I done? Or what you realize is, well, maybe God not as good as I thought God was because God promised good things to happen to me. And now look at this horrible thing that's happened. And so when they have these overly simplistic views of suffering, when adversity inevitably happens, the church is like, I don't know, pray more, right? Like the church isn't really sure how to help people who are suffering because the theology is based on, well, God is good all the time, God is good. If you've ever been in a church service and said that before, and you've been in a time when it doesn't feel very good and God doesn't feel very good, and some of you are like, oh, he's bordering line on blasphemy. Come on, we've all wondered that, right? All of us have wondered, what are you doing up there if you actually exist at all, right? Why won't you pick up my phone call? So the idea is that many religions offer overly simple accounts for suffering. They can't account for the cruelty of human suffering. If God blesses those who God loves, what does it mean for me if I suffer? Is God not good enough or not powerful enough, or am I not faithful enough? And then when you go to the fellow members of your church, they come to you and they give you a really helpful platitude that we all learned in Job is super helpful. And you tell them everything happens for a reason, right? That is terrible. Never say that, right? Job, we learn in Job when they're like, there's a reason for this. Job's like, I need new friends, right? Because they were basically blaming Job, or they're saying everything is going to work out. And Job's like, all I really want you to do is sit with me and realize that life is pretty terrible sometimes, right? And so what we actually need is more of a view of a God that suffers with us, right? Rather than the God that kind of causes the suffering. Okay, so that's the third view. The fourth view is a problematic label. I realize here's where I'm about to get a little controversial, but it's okay. We've hung out together before. You've heard me talk about humility, and I have pretty thick skin. So in the United States in particular, and particularly after 2016, the term evangelical became an increasingly politicized term. So a recent poll, this one blew my mind. I've been studying religion as long as I've been studying psychology. And what I found, what this poll said was that 40% of evangelicals do not believe in Jesus as God. Now, I'm not a theologian, but my sense is that the deity of Jesus is a central, if not the central component of evangelicalism, right? You kind of believe Jesus is God incarnate. So if 40% of people who say I'm evangelical do not believe in the deity of Jesus, you have to ask yourself, what precisely do they mean by evangelical then, if they say, oh, I'm an evangelical? And so what happened is, I believe the concept, the term evangelical means something very different post-2016 than it did pre-2016. And now I believe that evangelical means to many people, whether or not you believe this is what it should mean, what it actually means is a certain version of a fusion between religion and politics, of conservative religion and conservative politics, worked together in a way that both of them are mutually reinforcing. So for some people, they're like, that's great. That's exactly what I want to be. And for other people, they say, that's not at all what I want to be. So some people have left religion, and what they've really just left is the label. They've just said, I'm just not religious anymore. But if you look at any other feature of their quote unquote religious life, it looks very similar to the way before. They're just like, I don't want to be labeled as that. Okay, so we've got cultural stagnation, we've got religious trauma, we've got simplistic views of suffering, and we have a problematic label. Yes, we have a question here, if we can get the mic.
You say 2016. Are you referring to the sort of a political, particularly, we know a certain individual got elected president.
Yeah.
Who's identified closely with the so-called, instead of evangelical gospel, become I almost feel like saying mega gospel. And
Yeah.
do you think a lot of that's what really is driven this whole thing into where you say it's a toxic term now?
Yeah, so right. So in 2016, when all the polls came out and all the predictors, right, were like, well, we didn't see this coming. And then there are a few people that actually saw this coming. So the posters came out and they're like, well, how do we make sense of this? And what they found was 83% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And so among 17% who didn't, they're like, whoa, really? So is that what evangelical means? And I would put money on that. Of that 17%, at least 3/4 of those were like, okay, then I'm not that anymore, because they wanted to create a little bit of distance. And so, it's not new. Politics and religion being fused is not new. Like, this has been happening in the US for quite some time. But I do think that it created it was the awareness and attention on it was heightened, especially as people were trying to understand kind of why there were kind of mispredictions and kind of what was fueling an election that people didn't see happening. We do have a question down here.
Hold it. Evangelize?
Yeah. So the question is, isn't the basis of evangelical to evangelize?
Yeah, and you're describing it as a little bit different than just evangelizing.
Yeah. So right. So linguistically, the basis of the term evangelical is to evangelize, and that is part of what it has traditionally meant to be an evangelical, but that's not the entirety of what it's meant to be an evangelical. So, we can dig back into kind of I can go back to my theology classes here. So you've got Catholic, you've got Protestant, but then even among Protestant, to be evangelical means something particular. In part, it does mean to go share the gospel, your version of the gospel, to tell other people. But it also meant that you held a particular set of views about who Jesus Christ was, how God interacts with the world, what your role in the world is, and kind of your divine mission from God to not only evangelize, but to kind of shape the entire world around your version of religion. So yes, that is part of it, but not the entirety. Yeah, question.
Have you tested or considered developmental reasons for people leaving churches? For thinking about Rohr or Wilbur or Fowler, that people are growing beyond the boundaries?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So developmentally, I'll get to one slide where we did look a little bit at developmental trajectories. And so, right. So the question is like, is it possible that faith is just evolving right now and people are kind of transcending kind of some of these more what some would consider to be archaic boundaries, right? And just kind of being limited in. I do think where my research is taking me now is I just got a 3-year grant from the Templeton Foundation again to study people who are not religious but are engaged in what's called spiritual yearning, right? So these are people who are like, I'm not religious, but it's not like the spiritual aspect of them has been shut down. They're still looking for spiritual connection in different places and in different ways. And so it's possible that part of what we're seeing, I'm kind of an optimist. I work at a place called Hope College. So I'm kind of an optimist. I actually don't know that what we're describing and what we're seeing, and hang in here with me, that this mass exodus from religion, I actually don't know if that's quote unquote a bad thing. I'm actually not sure it is. And in fact, what we might be seeing is kind of a spiritual revolution of the same magnitude of the Great Awakening, but just in a different direction. And so part of what could be happening is people are leaving, but they're finding new ways of connecting it, and maybe in very Rohrian or Fowler ways of which they kind of go more universalistic, less tribal, and more spiritual. Yeah, question in the back.
And I would ask the follow-on question for the people that aren't leaving, that are staying.
Yeah.
That have been heavily catechized, trained, lived in the environment, yada, yada, that are finding church a lot of times redundant to the same message. They've heard again and again and again. It's like, come on, how about let's talk about heaven? Let's understand that better. Let's
Yeah.
look into some of the fringe parts of the Bible and try to understand what does that mean anyway? It's not here superfluously, it's here for a reason. So let's go and take a look and try to understand these things. But a lot of people don't seem to be doing that.
Yeah, right. So there's kind of almost like a lack of richness of what's actually going on at church. It's not meeting some different needs. Yeah. Yes, question.
We have one question online. What criteria must I consider before I answer the question, am I religious?
Yeah, so maybe I'm kind of a simpleton. So we just ask people, you can kind of put yourself in one of three buckets. I identify as religious. I used to identify as religious, but don't anymore. I've never identified as religious. So I just keep it on an identity level. And then what we'll get into is there's lots of different things, and people get into big fights about like, well, they're not really, and we'll kind of get into that. But if someone tells me they're religious, I'm not going to tell them you're actually not. Or if someone tells me that they're not, I'm not going to try to convince them that they are. I kind of tend to take people's word for it. So it's that level. All right, this is awesome. We're only 1 point in, and it's been 25 minutes. Perfect. At this point, we'll be done by Sunday. Okay. All right, big idea number 2. There's actually different ways to leave religion. And this goes into a little bit about, because there's different ways to be religious, there are also then different ways to leave religion. My colleague and I wrote this paper. This is just as the kids today say, these are the receipts, right? This is kind of the evidence that, we actually got this theoretical paper published. Here's kind of the framework. You can think about being religious in 4 different domains. Okay, you can think about being religion cognitively, emotionally, morally, and socially. So let's look at these. So cognitively, people might stop being religious when they disbelieve, right? When you say, well, I used to believe in God or angels or heaven or some major tenet of my religion, and I just don't anymore. And because of that, I'm no longer religious. You can think about being religious in terms of your emotional or ritualistic feelings or ritualistic practices. So this would be, so you can disengage from that. So these are things like prayer, or these would be things like meditation, right? So the feeling of closeness to God, right? So I used to pray, but now I'm not praying anymore, right? I used to sing, I don't sing anymore. A third way that you can discontinue, or that you can de-identify, is through what's called discontinuance. And this is when you basically stop following religion's rules for your life, right? So religion has a lot to say about what you can do with your body, like what you can eat, what you can't eat, what you can do with other people, what you shouldn't do with other people, right? It has a lot to say about that. So some people just stop listening to that. And so they're like, well, I'm not going to be religious because, a few verses tell me that my behaviors are causing me eternal damnation. I'm just going to stop listening to that. Or you can stop being religious by disaffiliating. So that's the social component. And that's where you just stop going to church or stop interacting or hanging out with the religious community. Yes.
What I talked to a lot of people who have had splits in their church.
Yeah.
And where does that fall? That rubric.
Yeah. So if the church splits and they still kind of both land in a church, then they probably aren't done. They've probably just revised some of their beliefs.
People that leave because of the split.
Oh, then they're probably disaffiliates, right? So if people just leave and they're like, I'm leaving church altogether because of this, then they would be a disaffiliate. So, yeah, we got a question in here. We'll make sure we get the mic for the folks on Zoom.
In some cases, the disaffiliation is a result of the discontinuance. In other words, some women or people have left their churches because of the position the church has taken on abortion, which is different than the position that they had. And so as a result of the moral behavior issue, they have disaffiliated.
Yeah, right. So it could be because of, right. And so these things are all kind of mixed together. And so, for example, I know this seems strange. I have a relative who absolutely does not believe in God at all. And he has been the most faithful deacon at his church for 30 years. And I asked him about that, and he was just like, oh, the community's great. Are you kidding? He's like, I wake up early, I get a donut, I put on my suit, I usher people, I help count the money. He's like, it's my favorite way to spend a Sunday morning. He's like, I can't find a better community, which is bizarre to me, right? And then there's other people who have left church, but they still very much believe in God. And in fact, many of them miss that community and they wish they could go into that community, but it just doesn't feel safe for them anymore. I was at a conference in 2018, 19. And I was taught, this was a conference of people who were kind of going through an evolution of their faith. And so I was chatting with a pastor there, and he confided to me, and he said, he's like, besides my wife, you were the first person I am telling this. I'm like, okay, I'm not a therapist. That's my wife. It's not me. I said, well, what is it? And he said, I don't believe in God anymore. And he was like a 55-year-old pastor. And I said, oh my gosh, okay, well, tell me about this. He's like, I can't leave my church. I was like, well, why? He's like, I hate to sound too pragmatic. He's like, but my retirement, I'm too close to retiring. He's like, if I were to leave my church, it would ruin my family and my future, right? So I just can't do that. And I'm like, well, what are you going to do? He's like, well, he's like, I know what to say. I can go through the motions. So he was a disbeliever who he was still praying. He was still leading other people to God. He was still living by the moral mandates. He just had the tiniest little smallest thing that he thought everything he was doing was completely untrue. But he didn't disaffiliate. So what we see is that we got a question in the back.
Just question for us to think about. How many of us have been in a church situation where we said, I'm finding it really hard to believe in this, or maybe you're in the choir and the words to the song are really dissonant in your mind.
Yes.
And you say to people, I just can't stand that. They said, nobody believes that. Just ignore it and go on about your business.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I mean, that is a great question. How many of us have been in those situations where we are harboring those doubts? And also how remarkable that would be like, oh yeah, no one believes that, let's just go to the potluck afterwards. And I think, what that highlights is that usually what happens is before this de-identification happens, usually there's some struggle, right? There's some struggle. So usually we will struggle with doubt before we start disbelieving. So that like, I don't really know about this. Maybe this isn't actually true. Or we have what are called moral struggles. And that's where we're really feeling as though we're being judged by our religious teachings for something morally that's, and we're not quite sure that we want to keep on, engaging in that way. A lot of people have interpersonal struggles before they disaffiliate. So they feel, they're having strife or conflict with people at their church or church in general. And then other people will have what are called supernatural struggles. So this is where you kind of feel anger toward God, or you feel, like the devil is out to get you. And that usually happens before kind of pulling away and kind of disengaging from religion. And sometimes what happens is when we experience suffering or we start questioning our meaning in life, that kind of can affect all of these different components and can cause us to pull away, right? So there's different ways to leave religion. Okay. Number 3, big idea number 3, all dones are not the same. Okay. We obviously, since we saw there's different ways to leave religion, there's got to be different types of religious dones out there. And so my colleagues and I did a study where we sampled people from different cultures. So from the United States, from the Netherlands, from Hong Kong. And what we were really curious about, we had 2 questions. We wanted to ask people, why are you leaving religion? And then we also wanted to figure out if there's different types of religious dones. So the reasons for leaving religion really mapped onto the 4 horsemen of religion's apocalypse, right? So about half of them reported intellectual reasons or said they had outgrew religion. That's kind of the cultural stagnation, right? About a fifth of them reported religious trauma. So that's the religious trauma explanation. 15% said because of personal adversity or suffering. So that's the thin, theologically simplistic views of suffering. And then another, 10%, 11% said there were social reasons. So like a problematic label. Someone said that their partner wasn't religious, so they just stopped being religious. Someone just wanted to go to brunch. Okay, then we looked at let's look at the types of people who say that they're actually done. And what we found was, I know this seems strange, there are two kind of big categories. So one are people who are actually done. Okay, they've really truly discontinued any type of religious practice. They're not going to church. They're not praying anymore. They're done. Like put a fork in them, they're done. That's different than a group that we found that are still practicing. So you're like, well, I don't quite understand this. So there is a subgroup of dones that are still going to church. They're still praying, right? They're in the choir, they're singing. They're like, I don't know if any of this is true. Sing with me, right? They're still practicing. Now, what we find is that the still practicing group actually has poorer mental health than the group that's completely done. They have worse mental health. Well, how do we know? They have worse positive affect. They have higher negative affect. They're more anxious. They're more depressed. They have more negative emotions toward God. Now, why might that be? Why might it be that the group that's still actually doing the religious behaviors is doing worse than the group that's completely done? Well, we think part of it has to do with the sense of integrity, right? So people who are saying they're done, but they're still going through the motions, that's a lot of what we psychologists call cognitive dissonance, right? That's a lot of inconsistency. You think you're done, but there you are. You're the pastor who doesn't believe giving the Sermon on the Mount, secretly thinking like, oh my gosh, what am I doing, right? It's much more kind of authentic, whether or not you agree with whether it's right or wrong. It's much more authentic if you're done, it should just be done. And so the group that's still kind of going through the motions or still is in transition and is still practicing, that's the group that has the poorer mental health. And my guess is, like, I love that question about, the choir member. My guess is you have people in your church, if you go to church, who are done, but they're still there. For whatever reason, they're still finding maybe they don't. I mean, so I'm not from West Michigan originally, and definitely not from Holland. Holland has like the highest per capita of churches I've ever seen, right? Like, I mean, like everyone at Hope could probably go to like a different church. Like there's so many churches here in Holland. I've never seen it before. And I've never been in a community where there's just an assumption you go to church. The two assumptions that everyone makes about every human who's over 18, how many kids do you have? Where do you go to church, right? Which if you were in any other metropolitan city, both of those would be offensive and intrusive, right? Why do you assume I have kids? Why do you assume I go to church? Not here in Holland, right? Well, where do you go to church? Oh, how long have you been going? Did your grandparents found the church like my grandparents founded the church? They can show you a picture of their great-grandfather with Jesus in the church, right? So you can imagine the social penalty, especially in this community, that some people would have to pay for actually admitting, I don't go to church, right? I mean, I have friends who will tell me, they're like, yeah, I go to church. I'm a Presbyterian. I go as often as Presbyterians go, right? Or, kind of as an Anglican. How often do Anglicans go? That's me. I'm a Christmas and Easter Anglican, but at least I can say I go to church, right? Because for some people, there's a penalty to pay, right? And so all this is to say, the still practicing dones who are in congregations, if you go to church, because I won't presume that you do, because I'm not from here, but if you do, my sense is that they are struggling. They're feeling more anxious. They're feeling more depressed. Their mental health is not doing as well as if, honestly, and I know this seems counterintuitive, they just left. There would just be a greater sense of integrity. We have a question over here. We'll wait for the mic.
I'm sorry, I came in late, so maybe you explained this, but how are you measuring the anxiety, happiness, depression? Is it on a standard test or by an interview or self-reporting or what?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. These are self-reported standardized scales.
Okay,
Yeah, so scales that have been used thousands of times, we give them to these people. Yeah.
okay. And do you know the simple answer to why people don't go to church?
Uh,
Because it's raining and because it's not raining.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. But what I was saying before is like, I've also bought a car in the rain because I really needed a car.
But do you feel that there is possibly a good deal of lying about going on when people think about themselves or describe themselves? Maybe not, maybe sort of unconsciously lying to themselves, but covering something up somehow. They're not saying what it really was.
About why they're not going to church?
Yes.
Yeah, I've gotten this question before, and that is possible. So it is possible that, I mean, we might not completely know why we're going, like why we're not, going to church. But I think I'd probably believe people as much as I would believe people if I asked them, why did you break up with your partner? Right. And if someone says I broke up with my partner because they were mean, right, or they never cleaned the laundry, or, they went out for cigarettes and they never came back, and that was 4 years ago. That probably believe them. Now, were there other things maybe that were going on that contributed? But yes, but in their mind, the most salient thing is the thing that they're going to tell us. Yeah. I mean, I also have, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I also have given, I've heard, or I've given this talk before. And one time I gave this talk and I said, people are leaving church. And this was actually in a group of pastors, right? This was like an academic group of pastors. And I was giving this talk. And the pastor raised his hand, and, after I kind of gave my big, here's why people are leaving. And he just said, good. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. This was over Zoom. And I'm like, I don't know if I heard you. Are you on mute? And he's like, no, good. I was like, well, why is it good that people are leaving? And he's like, separate the wheat from the chaff. He's like, they were chaff the entire time. He's like, and what we'll see is the actual true church emerge after this great dechurching. And so to me, maybe he's right. I doubt it. I might be optimistic, but I'm not naive. I'm a little bit more skeptical, right? While I do think some people will remain, I don't think that's the best perspective if the church is supposed to be embracing all who would want to come, right? If the church truly is like the body of Christ, I don't think we say like, well, you're kind of a lazy hand, right? Like we're not gonna hold people out. So there is a sense, there is kind of a counter push to this, where there are some factions that say this is the thing we've been waiting for so long. This is the refining fire, and the people who are leaving were never meant to be there to begin with. All right, big idea number 4. This is my favorite idea. This is not only my favorite idea of the talk, this might be my favorite idea that I've ever studied ever. My wife said, this is it. She said, I've reached my peak. Now that I found this out, she's like, I can go into the sunset. So this is an idea called religious residue. So we did a study with more than 30,000 participants, more than 35,000 participants, United States, Hong Kong, Netherlands, New Zealand. Here's what we found. When people leave religion, there's an aspect or aspects of their religion that stick with them. There's a residue that remains after people leave religion. In fact, people who are religious duns, who are firmly religious, they more closely resemble currently religious people than people who have never been religious at all. Right? So if you think that religion is just something you can walk away from, then never religious people and people who left religion should be identical. When you examine them, they should literally have the same psychological profiles. But what we found was that people who have left religion are actually more closely similar to currently religious people than are never religious people. So why is that? Why is it that religion is kind of hard to shake? There's 3 big reasons. One is a cognitive reason. So all of us have these things called schemas. Schemas are mental frameworks for seeing the world. I like to think about schemas as glasses, right? They help us interpret the world. They're the lens through which we see the world. If you've been religious, you have a religious way of understanding the world. If tomorrow you decided you weren't religious, it's not like all of a sudden your brain would be like, okay, I'll make brand new pathways that are just as efficient and, just as quick as I've used for all this time. So schemas are really, really hard to change. And so if you've seen the world in a particular way for years, for decades, after you leave religion, your brain's going to still see the world in that way. The second reason is behavioral. Religion and religious rituals are habits. So I know people who have left religion. They no longer believe in God. They sit down, and when their meal comes at the restaurant, what's the first thing they do? They bow their head and they're like, wait a minute, I don't believe, right? But in that moment, their habit was, we pray. That's what we do. Because religious rituals are habitualized, and it's hard to shake that. And then a third reason why why religion sticks with us after we leave is because we're embedded in these socialized religious communities. So I hear this is what I call the Thanksgiving problem, right? So people who have left religion, they're feeling good about having left religion, then they go home for the holidays and they're with their very religious family. And then they start having all those feelings come back, right? And the more they're socializing with religious people, the more likely they are to kind of act and think and feel religiously. So what did we do? Well, we assessed as much as we possibly could. We looked at their self-reported scales. So things like their attitudes toward God, their religious commitment, their religious certainty, even how often they practiced religious practices. And what we see is that people who have left religion are kind of more religious still than people who have never been religious. We even looked at this implicitly. So implicitly means we're kind of going beyond that self-report. And we put them through this test where we implicitly assess their attitudes toward God. And even on an implicit level, religious dones have a more favorable attitude towards God than people who have never been religious. We looked at their behavior. We gave them the opportunity to donate money, and we looked at volunteering behavior. And what we see is that religious dones give more money and are more likely to continue volunteering, much like their religious counterparts. And we saw this in multiple cultures. We saw this over time. So I'll just skip through that. So for example, this is like the implicit test. We have the currently religious on the left, the formerly religious in the middle, and the never religious on the right. And you see that nice stair-step pattern of implicitly assessed attitudes toward God. So why do we think this might be happening? Like, what leads to religious residue? Well, part of it could be that the people that are most likely to stick around in religion, the ones that stay, are the ones where their parents made, or their caregivers made, high sacrifice behaviors according to their religion. So what does that mean? They look to their caregivers as role models for religion. And if their parents were making sacrifices, if their parents were not like animal sacrifice, but like time and money sacrifices, if their parents were going out of their way to prioritize religion, those were the people that stayed. The parents that were a little bit less behavioral about their religion, the ones that were a little bit more laissez-faire, those were the ones that were more likely to leave. So what do you do? So when you're a psychologist and you're trying to make a name in a field, if you find something, you see if you can find it everywhere. So we went and we found that there's religious residue related to morality. So what we see is that religious dones' morality, people who have left religion, their morality looks more similar to currently religious people than never religious. And in fact, what we see, though, is over time, there is something called a residual decay. So what does that mean? When you first leave religion, you're going to keep acting, thinking, feeling religious very strongly. But over time, months, years, it starts to decay. Now, some religious residue will always stick around, but it's much less strong the further you get from having left religion. We see religious residue in personal values. So religious dones have personal values that are much more like currently religious people than people who have never been religious. And it's particularly strong among religious people who were raised in fundamentalist or evangelical upbringings. That's where religious residue is the strongest. We even see religious residue with spending behaviors. People who are formerly religious are willing to spend more money on religious products, which is strange. They're not even religious anymore, but they're so used to doing that. So the take-home message is they engage in more religious consumption, are more likely to have a morality that looks like religious people. They have values and behaviors much more consistent with being with their religious past. Okay. Big idea number 5, a sheep in wolf's clothing. Now, many of us have heard of a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? So the wolf in sheep's clothing is the sheep kind of looks all nice and innocent, looks like it's part of the flock, right? That's where you kind of get the idea. But then secretly, it's like a ravenous wolf who's not a believer, who's waiting to kind of pounce on you and lead you astray. What we wanted to figure out is, how are religious duns perceived, right? People who have left religion, how are they perceived by currently religious people and never religious people? What we found was that religious duns are actually seen as a sheep in wolves' clothing. So what does that mean? They're perceived by currently religious people and never religious people as still being kind of religious. So if you find out that someone's left religion, their outward identity is non-religious. Their outward identity is quote unquote like a wolf. But inwardly, you think, oh, down deep, you're still religious. So what happened? So how did we figure this out? Well, we ran a series of 6 studies over 5,000 participants. And what we see is that currently religious people really like the religious duns. Like, they like them so much. But the religious duns don't like the currently religious. They're like, stay away from me. You're the group I left. Religious duns, though, really like the never religious people. They're like, you're the group I've always wanted to be, right? You're my hero. The never religious people say, I don't like you. Now, why is that? We asked, and the never religious people don't trust the religious duns. They said, oh, you've been religious before. I don't trust you. I don't trust you. Are you just trying to convert me, right? Are you still going to be religious? I don't trust you. So religious duns are in this social paradox, right? The group that really likes them, the currently religious who really likes them, they don't like them. Right? The duns don't like them in return. And the group that they really like doesn't return their favor. It's like being at a middle school dance, right? The person you want to dance with is dancing with someone else. The one that wants to dance with you, you're not interested in, right? So it's kind of isolating to be a religious dun. We also asked the currently religious people, well, why do you like the religious duns so much? And it's because they actually think the religious duns are coming back. They did. They're like, you're going to change. You're going to come back to the fold. This is a phase. But then we asked the religious duns, and the religious duns told us, no, this is not a phase. Like, I think I'm actually done. So the duns knew they were done. The currently religious were like, you're going through a phase. This is your religious teenage years. Come on back. We love you. And the never religious said, I don't trust you. Once you've been religious, you're always religious. Stay away from me. And so it's really tough to be a religious dun. So let's start putting some of these pieces together. You left religion because of cultural stagnation, or you were being abused, or you experienced trauma. You didn't like the label. Suffering, you experienced some suffering because you're already experiencing some pain. If you're still at church, your mental health is kind of plummeting. And then the groups you want to hang out with don't want to hang out with you. And the group that does want to hang out with you, you don't want anything to do with. Well, it's a tough time to be a religious dun. So they're viewed as the sheep in wolf's clothing, inwardly religious despite an outward non-religious identity. Who do they hang out with? And so what we find is that religious duns actually hang out a lot with other religious duns. And do you know what they actually spend a lot of their time, at least early on in the relationship, talking about? Religion, right? They get together and they're like, man, religion was terrible. And they're like, tell me about it, right? And so what they do is they engage in what's called like this co-rumination, or other people have called it like trauma bonding. And so what they do is they keep saying like, man, how bad was religion for you? Well, I can one up you on that, right? And they keep going round and round and round. Well, hold on, just a second. I'll get to it in just a second. So the benefit of that, the positive thing of that is it's good to have support, right? It's good to kind of express your feelings, how you've been hurt. The problem with that is if you're a religious dun and all the time you're hanging out with friends, all you're doing is talking about how bad religion is and how you're not religious, your identity is still what? Being defined by religion, which is literally the thing you want out of your life. So your identity is still yoked to this thing that you don't want. And so it can be a very tumultuous time for duns. Yeah.
What about cultural Christians? You have people who, they're the women in the house will talk about getting together on the 4th of July and having a picnic or doing whatever. And they'll do the same thing at Easter and Christmas. In other words, I would use the term Christianish, sort of cultural Christians, where they celebrate Christmas and they celebrate Easter. But aside from those two opportunities, they really view their religion in the same way as they do Memorial Day or the 4th of July.
Yeah, so people for whom religion is not that important, if they leave religion, it's not going to have as much residue. It's not going to be as stuck with them. But you can contrast that though if you were raised religiously fundamentalist, right? Or you can imagine people who were raised in some religious sects or groups where there was a lot of control, right? Like maybe there was a common purse that managed all your finances, or maybe there were strict rules that you could only marry within that religious group. Leaving that is far more difficult and is going to have far, more long-reaching effects than if you were just kind of like mildly Christian and decided to leave. So the pressure, really the pressing task for religious duns is, how do you start shaping an identity that's beyond just not being religious, right? In the same way, like when you talk to someone who's an atheist, they're like, I don't want to be defined as like not believing in God. Like I also play racquetball, and I grow cucumbers or whatever, right? They don't want to be just not something. So how, if you're a religious dun, do you kind of craft an identity that's richer than just not that? And then that's a big question. That's kind of some of the work that religious duns are trying to sort out currently. So they experience this unique social isolation paradox. Okay, big idea number 6, to hell with the devil. I promise this is not curse words on the slide. This is just an instruction. Okay, so what do we mean by to hell with the devil? I have to give credit to this idea to my wife. So my wife is a therapist, and she sees clients, and some of her clients are undergoing religious change, and some of her clients undergo kind of this process of leaving religion. And, I was telling her about some of my research on religious residue at dinner, and she was saying, one of the things that, I've noticed when I'm talking to some of my clients is that although they've left religion and they don't even believe in God anymore, the one thing that they can't shake is this fear of hell. I was like, really? She's like, yeah, they just can't shake this fear of hell. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And so we started talking back and forth, and we were raised, in the 80s and 90s. And if you've ever been or sent a child or know someone who's been to a Christian church camp, you kind of do all these like funny things. And one of the big urban legends at these Christian camps where people would say, if you go into the bathroom and you close the door with all the lights out, and you recite Bloody Mary 3 times, this thing is supposed to like come out of the mirror, right? And then when you're a little kid, you're like, that's the scariest thing I've ever heard of. I can't believe that. So my wife and I kind of knew that growing up. And so she was saying, like, do you believe that that's true? I'm like, absolutely not. Like, that seems like a child's tale. And she said, oh, great. Then why don't you go do it? And I was like, absolutely not. I would never do that. And she's like, why won't you do that if you don't believe? I'm like, I'm not messing around with that. That just seems ridiculous. And she's like, hold on, you are like an expert in this area. You have a PhD. You surely know this is not true. And you're not going to go do that. I said, I would not touch that with a 10-foot pole. How about you? And she's like, oh, I don't believe in it either, but I'm not doing it either. And she's like, you've got to study this. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, I think what you need to study is, do the negative parts of religion kind of stick around even after people have left religion? And if so, like, why are they sticking around? And so I kind of pair that with one of the other criticisms I had gotten when I presented this work is someone said, okay, great. This is all well and good. Okay. You show people that have left religion, they're still generous and they're still pro-social and they still volunteer. This is also positive. Do any of the negative parts of religion stick around? Like, get into it. I'm like, oh, okay. So thanks to my wife's prompting, my students and I, last year, we ran this study where we wanted to see if the negative aspects of religion persist. Now, in psychology, there's this big principle that's called the negativity bias. What this means is we pay attention to negative information much more than positive information. So, for example, if your boss says that you did on your annual review 3 good things and 1 bad thing, what are you going to remember after that? The 1 bad thing. Well, why is it that we always remember the bad things? Well, the answer is kind of barbaric, right? The answer is, if you think about over evolutionary history, there's 2 types of people. There's people who pay attention to the positive things and people who pay attention to the negative things. Let's say I'm walking back across campus and I see something rustling in the bushes. Now, if I'm a positive person, I'm like, oh, maybe that's nothing. Maybe this is some type of, friendly animal. I'm going to go approach that. Versus if I'm a negative person, I pay attention. I'm like, oh no, that's the escaped lion from the zoo, and I run the other direction. Now, the people who were more negative, they were more likely to detect threats in their environment. So they survived. The positive people were like, hey, what is that? They got eaten. Okay, they didn't survive. They didn't reproduce. So the idea is we're the ancestors of all the negative people because it's actually something pretty adaptive to be negative, right? If you think something's a threat, you're like, I'm going the other direction, you can at least live to fight another day. If something's a threat and you're wrong and you're like, I'm going to go give it a hug, you probably, you could die. So there's this negativity bias that we all have. We wonder, does the same thing hold true for religion? Like, do we hold on to these negative beliefs more? The other reason why I think it's so hard to shake this belief in hell and the devil is, think about this. The stakes are so high, aren't they? This is literally like the one thing you can't be wrong about, right? If you're wrong about it and you spend eternity being like, I shouldn't have gone to the bathroom and said the thing, right? Like, you do not want to be wrong about hell and the devil, especially if you were raised being taught this is the one thing you have to avoid at all costs, right? We can get by you voting for an independent, but do not go to hell. Okay, here's what we find. Religious duns actually retain a greater belief in hell and the devil relative to people who have never been religious. So there is religious residue for these negative religious beliefs. We even see this. This is the one that I actually I was shocked even when I saw this myself in my own data. When you just look at atheists, people who no longer believe in God, they still demonstrate a greater belief in hell and the devil relative to people who have never been religious. So people would more quickly abandon their belief in God than they would in hell or the devil. Because again, the stakes are so high, right? You're like, that could be real. I don't want to mess with that. That could be real. So we say basically relinquishing your belief in the devil appears to be as hard as hell. Okay, so we've gone through all, question. We'll get the mic up here.
I think one of the things that is hard not to believe in hell, even though I don't believe in hell, is the fact of what do you do with these people you're sure deserve it? Like
yeah, that's right.
Like Hitler, you want to say, okay, vengeance is mine, says the Lord.
Yeah.
But if there's no hell, it's hard to let go of that fact that you want to be the godfather and make somebody an offer they can't refuse.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So, there's really probably good reason. Now, I'm not going to wade into the epistemology or ontology as to whether or not hell exists. I want you to invite me back, and I don't want some of you to be mad at me. Whether or not hell exists, whether or not it exists, it's a pretty powerful and effective tool for deterring socially unwanted behavior. And whether or not it exists, I think we can all see why the belief, whether or not it is true, has persisted. And that's because it actually helps restore our illusion, and I do think it's an illusion, that the world is just. Because when we see really horrible things and we're like, there's nothing I can do about that. But if there were a place where they could get not only what they deserve, but much, much more, then I would feel better about things. Now, again, I don't want to wade too much theologically. One could argue that all of us have done the things that are kind of reprehensible, but probably not to the degree that, if I jaywalk, or forget to pay for an apple, it's, the same as committing genocide or kind of, systematic, oppression or things like that. So yeah, the belief in hell persists because it helps rebalance our scales of cosmic justice. And it's very unsatisfying to think, well, maybe they just got away with it. Yeah. Okay, so because I'm guessing that all of us at least know one person or have heard of one person in our social circle that has left religion, what do? Right? If part of this is us learning to be good people, learning to kind of embrace people who are at different stages of their journey in faith or away from faith, how do we embrace the religious duns? Right. And I want us to learn some lessons from some of this research. Okay. So the first thing that we can do is, if you are part of a faith community, encourage your faith community to avoid cultural stagnation. Right. So you can encourage your faith community to actually start thinking about the ways in which, their religious teachings or stances might be a little bit more antiquated and are no longer meeting the needs of an evolving group that's, that no longer finds church to be of any use. And this is hard, right? It reminds me of the story. I'm sure many of you have heard this before, of the pastor who got hired at a new church. And there was a piano right in the middle of the sanctuary. And he thought that the piano should actually be in the foyer. And so he comes in, he's like, I'd love to take the position, everything looks great. Can we just move the piano into the foyer? And they were like, oh my gosh, no. That piano has been in the sanctuary since, we created this church. And he's like, oh my gosh, big outroar. We'll never move the piano. So the pastor says, okay. And every Sunday, as the pastor was leaving the pulpit, he would move the piano 2 inches. And after a few years, the piano was in the foyer. Right. So it's one of those things where you probably can't go to a church and say, I listened to some guy give a talk about cultural stagnation, so we need to revise our theology, right? They'll probably laugh at you and, ask you to go, oversee nursery. Instead, this probably takes time, but just be aware that people are leaving church probably more rapidly than churches can push the piano. So I just want us to be aware of that. The second is, and I feel very, very strongly about this, we need to be very attentive to rooting out and fighting and protecting people against religious abuse and trauma. Religious systems of abuse have a way of protecting themselves. So I actually got into a pretty deep dive this summer when I was finishing a book. So all of this is going to be in a book that's coming out in the spring by American Psychological Association on kind of leaving religion. So this summer, I was watching all these documentaries on people leaving religion. So I watched a documentary called Shiny Happy People. I watched a documentary about the Hillsong Church, the big mega church. And these abusive systems have a way of protecting the abusers. Sadly, what happens when people come forth with abuse allegations, they're the ones that are excommunicated. right? Or the abusers are given a church plant in a bigger city or things like that. So we need to work to fight against that. We cannot be participants in a system that perpetuates religious abuse and trauma. The first 2 inches I would like us to move, if you are a person of faith or in a faith community, is to stop toxic positivity, shut down the prosperity gospel. This is a weird mix of American consumerism and capitalism gone sideways to sell a book on how to get rich based on God. We need to have more theologically rich views of suffering. Like in my mind, the theologically rich view of suffering is I can't explain it. That's all I know. Suffering is terrible and horrible, and the best thing I can do with you is sit with you. That's it, right? Like that was the lesson from Job. Don't try to explain it. Well, actually, no, just practical presence. Be with the person who's suffering. Where is God? I don't know. I too am angry. Can I sit with you? Maybe God suffers with us. That's my hope, but I can't explain it. The number 4, I actually think this is a pretty powerful thing that we can do now. We can move the piano a lot more than 2 inches right now. If you're a person of faith, and if you are a religious person and a Christian in America, you can actually start rewriting that label right now, right? Because people who have left and they're like, I don't like that label. That's not me. How radical would it be if someone says, are you a Christian? You said, yes, and let me explain to you how, right? Let me explain to you that it's probably not like you think. The 5th thing we can do is please, please, please understand that when people said they've left religion, that you can take them at their word. Understand when done, say I'm done, that their change is real, right? Don't be the folks who are like, you're going through a phase, you'll come back. Because that maybe you can think that, but just don't express that to the people who are sharing with you. Because if they're sharing with you this aspect of their identity, especially in a community like Holland, Michigan, where you go to church carries a lot of social clout, and if you don't, oh, really? Then the rumors start. If someone's sharing this part with you, it's like analogous to other situations where people are disclosing a part of their identity that they might feel kind of ashamed about or uncertain about or worried about you judging them. Understand that all duns are different. So just because, even I don't know all the duns because I study them, right? Everybody has a different story, a different journey, a different path of where they started from and now where they are. So try to get to know their story. And then, like I said, I am kind of an optimist. I kind of do actually believe in the overwhelming transformative power of love. It's just too compelling not to believe. And when you've experienced it in your own life, it seems pretty powerful. So if we can love people, even if you might disagree with why people are leaving or the fact that they left at all, I think that could be pretty transformative. Yeah, question.
On your number 4, rewrite the label. I like your description, but doesn't that also include acting the description?
It does. Right. So it does include acting the description. So there have been many times, I think, when the simple presence and action of a person of faith in a place where people of faith have not been, and acting in a way that's consonant with love, with charity, with respect, has been so powerful and is much more powerful than any other, 4 spiritual laws or here's 8 ways to convert you. But just actually saying, no, I'm a Christian and I'm doing this. And people are like, oh, wow, really? Christians can do that? And right. Yeah. So living out that label in a way that is consistent with those descriptions. Well, that's what I've got. Thank you. I've got a book coming out by American Psychological Association in 2024. I'd love to open the floor for shorter speeches disguised as questions.
You may have noticed that there's a different demographic here than in your college classes.
Yes. That's why I love it. I love it.
How much do the numbers change, or people who are done in their 50s or 60s as compared to people who are done in their 20s and 30s?
Yeah, this is much more a younger I think there's two things. So it's younger people, and I think there's a generational component. So people do leave when they're older. It's much fewer. This is a much younger thing. I think that, and this is what I'm going to say might be a little controversial, so it's fine. I've only got like 16 more minutes. Part of why I think we're seeing an acceleration of people leaving is I think that there was a certain generation of evangelical Christians raised in America in the 80s, 90s, that's hitting an age right now that are leaving. And I wouldn't be totally surprised if some of the trends leveled out a bit. So I think we're seeing like these stark decreases in religion. I would not be surprised if things leveled a bit. I'm not saying that they'll go completely flat, but I think what we're seeing is almost a generation of evangelical Christians raised in a particular ilk that are kind of disaffected by how they were raised and are leaving. But their children then are going to likely be even less inclined to be religious. So another explanation for why some of this is going on. Don Leidens, who has been in the Hope faculty for many years, he said a very easy sociological explanation for this is it's kind of a coin flip, 1 and 2, right? So if you're religious and you have 8 kids, 4 will be religious, 4 won't be, right? But now and so those 4 go into church, right? They replace you and your partner who pass away, churches grow. As people have fewer kids, they have 2 kids, flip a coin, one's religious, one's not, one stays in the church, the other doesn't, church population declines. So it's much more of a younger thing.
I have a follow-up to his comment. So there's leaving the church and there's switching what type of church you attend. And I didn't really hear you talk too much about that. I mean, I particularly go to a very progressive church at the moment. I wasn't brought up in the CRC because I'm not from this area. But, can you talk to that aspect of your study and what you see?
So sometimes people go through everything I described, right? They doubt, they question, they wrestle, they get really frustrated. But then there's a fork in the road. And I didn't talk about this, and the fork in the road is stay or go. But the stay is not like, well, I've wrestled through all of this and I'm going to go right back to the same fundamentalist beliefs that I was wrestling with. The stay is actually, so if the go is de-identification to becoming a done, the stay after this deconstruction is what's called reconstruction. And the stay is, I'm going to find a new faith community still within my big tent, but my beliefs are completely different, right? So it's like, maybe I was raised super conservative and I go through all of this deconstruction and I reconstruct and I find a home at a progressive Christian church. And those are folks who maybe kind of went more toward that liminal border of leaving, but they've still stayed. And I have heard people, I'll get yours and just say, I have heard people who said, I was raised in this really like Pentecostal, charismatic church, but I didn't like their theology. So I left to a church that had great theology and it's really stuffy, right? And so what they've told me, they've come up and they've said, my religious residue is when I'm in the front row, I want to be raising my hands and dancing. And I'm over here and we're singing a hymnal, and we're the frozen chosen. And so even among shifting within religious denominations, there's actually still residue. There's still that going on. Yes.
So the 4 horsemen.
Yes.
The 4th one seems to be a new phenomenon, but the other 3 have been around forever.
That's right.
What caused them to percolate to the surface and become significant?
Yeah, that's true. So, the 3 really have been there. I think that is a good question. I think that it might be, there's probably some socio-political factors that are going on that brought some of these things to the head. So there's some research that suggested that people kind of thought that religion was on a decline. And then in the 80s and 90s, there was like the moral majority and like the Christian religious right kind of buckled down and kind of organized and kind of stabilized the ship and actually kind of increased religious engagement. So I think that there have been a lot of socio-political factors that have been going on. And it could be that, we do see that for 30 years, there's kind of been that trickle. And then after 2016, I think things just got thrust up into public awareness and consciousness that we're just talking about these things more. I think that's one. A second, and I don't want to sound like this is a lot of times people's easy answers, but I don't necessarily think this is true. This is an easy answer. I do think that social media has made it a lot easier for people to communicate their stories and struggles of deconversion and de-identification that then builds communities that might accelerate some of that process. So for example, when people convert, you can have a testimony, but usually when people deconvert, there's not like a similar like deconversion testimony, right? Like some people are like, I was on drugs and I found Jesus. Most people aren't like, I was on Jesus, then I found drugs, right? It doesn't kind of go the other direction. But with social media and people having a greater access to a wider number of people to share their stories, that can accelerate, I think, some of this. Yeah, question.
Growing up in a small town in New York State, we had the people and were generally expected to go to church and was often considered something that's good for your business relationship and your social standing in the community. And I think as time went on, what many of the younger people saw as a profound hypocrisy. And I think it's a lot of what often turns people off from religion or church in general, because we seem like we're talking about the Christian church, is the profound level of hypocrisy. Say, if you want to find a hypocrite, just go to your nearest church and you'll find them. And so there are different kind of ways of being religious, and one is kind of like, oh, I'm going to be religious for the social, right? Or other people are religious because like, no, I actually believe that it's true, and it's right. And so some of those extrinsically motivated kind of social reasons might have fallen off a bit. And yeah, part of that hypocrisy was we saw in some of our data as well. And then next one after,
I just had a quick thought here. When you talk about being religious, you generally think of being good. And that term of, are people good if they go to church? And if they leave the church, are they less good?
Yeah. So, that's a great question. I mean, I'm kind of the mindset that there's good and bad people in and out of church. Like good, the line between good and evil cuts through every human heart. I think religion promotes kind of this pro-sociality and this expectation to be good, but I certainly don't think people that have left are any worse than people who stay at church are good. Yeah, but there might be that public perception. So we'll go here, and then if you can get the mic. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about for younger generation, particularly that the LGBTQ issue is a big one. Of maybe perhaps why younger folks are drifting away. It seems that another factor, tell me if I'm right on this, that it appears that that Christian churches particularly have weaponized hostility to that community. And have you seen that? Have you studied that? Is that true? By weaponized, I mean that it not only is are some Christians saying, I don't believe in this, they shouldn't be here, we won't worship with them, we won't marry them, but we are going to go a step farther and we're going to throw them in jail, or we're going to not allow them to love who they love, or we are going to demonize someone because they've come out as trans. And is that trend also impacting the leaving of the churches?
Yeah. So all of that together is, I would put either in the cultural stagnation or depending on who you are, religious abuse and trauma. So that is a big motivation for why a number of people kind of have left religion and see certain expressions of religion as antiquated or outdated.
Yes, I have two questions. One, how big a factor has this LGBT and abortion thing been on the churches?
Yeah, so I mean, we have seen the decline for 30 years. But I think if you ask a number of some of the data that in the book and that I'm referring to here, like a pretty significant proportion of people who have left have said that's a big issue. Yeah.
Are there any studies of what churches are losing or gaining more people?
Yeah, I mean, so Ryan Burge is a sociologist at in Illinois. He does a lot of these kind of studies. I mean, it's interesting. So sometimes some of the progressive churches are actually filled with older adults. And so counterintuitively, those are kind of decreasing in population as we move through time. In part because some people, if they are not progressive and they're in a conservative place, will just leave rather than reconstruct and find a progressive place. So, so sometimes while we would imagine kind of a strong drip away from conservative churches, sometimes conservative churches still have a pretty strong, strong base.
Are there any other questions? Well, please, let's give Dr. Van Tongeren a round of applause.